Hey everyone, this is Otsukimi. Who else would it be? This is the BRC-20 ecosystem video, um, otherwise known as Ordinals, otherwise known as Bitcoin NFTs. There's a lot of varying names and jargon attached to it. We'll get into that as well to understand the differences, the similarities. A lot of it is honestly just naming conventions to make it easier to understand because BRCs can't exist in the same way that ERCs exist, and we'll get into that and later on in the presentation. And so this is a presentation. This is one of the special videos that I do. I try to do about two a month. I want to apologize for a few things right off the bat. First of all, this has been delayed roughly about a week, week and a half. Part of that is because of the holidays. So again, I apologize for that. In addition, we will be doing another video in rapid succession here, probably tomorrow. I think either tonight or tomorrow, more than likely tomorrow. I will discuss in the premium chat what you guys want to see as far as your other video. In addition to that, one of the reasons I've been delaying the video is to record this properly. There's been a lot of logistical problems, having to switch different rooms because of the holidays. My son has been sick. My wife hasn't been feeling too good herself, and then there's also construction. I don't really know why there's construction here at this time of year. We I tend to joke a little bit sometimes. It's like we don't get our trash taken out because of holiday delays, but there's you know horns blaring and construction noise going on. So if you hear that, I apologize. This will be an edited video, and I'll try to edit those out. I've got tools to do that. But if you do hear one or two, I do apologize. I've delayed this as long as I can to do it properly, but just some things come up. So that being said, this is going to be the BRC-20 presentation video. Ordinals is also another word that you guys hear. Bitcoin NFTs, as I've all said, and so we'll kind of get started into the layout of this presentation, what this means, and also I want to preface this to say if you have any questions or any details that you want answered, please let me know after this video. I don't know how long this video will be. The last video for the Solana ecosystem took a little over an hour. And honestly, I'm just going to take my time with this to give you the information that you need in order to move forward with. In addition, this is not an exhaustive presentation by any means. This is more of just a primer because, to be honest with you, 2 months ago, I didn't know very much myself about BRC 20s and ordinals, and I don't think most people did either. That's probably one reason why this request was made, right? Because you guys didn't know yourselves. I'm typically always researching these topics, not just for trading sake, but also for tech sake. And so this kind of merged well with that. So just to keep in mind, this is not exhaustive by any means. I can do more videos to make this more exhaustive if you prefer. So anyway, that's all the preliminary stuff. Let's go ahead and get started with. And so first things first, I'm going to go into a little bit of a detail about what this presentation and video will detail. So we're going to have 8 sections total right here. So the first thing here is what are BRCs and what is the BRC-20 ecosystem? And so there's going to be a few different things going on. Like I said, there's probably 3 or 4 different naming conventions that kind of blur the lines of what I'm trying to say. And so I may use these words interchangeably, and I'll do my best not to. But BRC is actually just a naming convention based off of ERC. BRC does not stand for anything. Okay, ERC is based off of the Ethereum network architecture. So ERC-20, ERC naming conventions, like ERC 1155 is an NFT token, where ERC-20 is more of like a layer 2 token. And so and whether you may know this or not, NFTs, I mean, are tokens of themselves, hence the name NFT is non-fungible token. And so it's a different protocol on the Ethereum ERC based architecture. And so BRCs don't stand for anything. It's just a way to get us to understand what BRCs are. They're basically like ERCs in that sense. And so, like, another thing is with the naming conventions, like, it's ordinals is usually the word that comes up very often. And so ordinals, and that'll be the second thing here is like, what are ordinals and inscriptions? So to some extent, BRCs and ordinals are the same. In some ways, they're different. We'll get into that as well. Ordinals is probably the more um, accurate of all the terms, and inscriptions are as well. But inscriptions take many forms, ordinals take some other forms, and so there's varying differences. We'll get into that. And so that's the second portion of this. And so going into the third one here is like, are ordinals legit? What's the controversy? You may have seen this online where people are arguing about ordinals. Like, some people don't know they exist, some people do. And there's other people, mainly Bitcoin maxis, that are really furious about ordinals. And so I'll go into why that is and what's the reasoning for that. And I thought about leaving that out on the presentation, but I wanted to include it because I think it gives a better context over why this tech has formed and the reasons. Because I'm pro ordinal. I think ordinals and BRCs are good. But I also want to look at the other side of this and say what is what are some good things they might have to say? Do they have legitimate points on what they're trying to say? And if so, what how can we reason with that as a whole? Because I do think, one, if you want to believe a certain thing or if you want to do a certain thing, I do think looking at the other side from a rational perspective and weighing those eight things out will help strengthen your positioning as well. So we'll take a look at that. And it's not as serious as I'm really saying either. But we'll look at both sides, the pros and the cons, so to speak. And in the fourth section, we're going to look at the differences between BRCs and ERCs and other chains. We'll take a look at that, and it's very simple. In some ways, a lot of other chains like Solana do things completely different, and so we'll just take a look at that. Number five is going to be the introduction to the Ordinal protocol. We'll analyze what that means, how that works, and so it'll give you some idea of what that looks like. And so that's going to be a little more tech heavy, so just keep that in mind. And the sixth one is going to be ordinals versus NFTs. Are there similarities? Are there differences? How does that work? Are ordinals NFTs? In some ways they are, in some ways they are not. So we'll take a look at that. And then on the seventh section of this, we're going to look at BRC tokens, because there is a difference between the BRC NFTs and the BRC-20 tokens. So when I say BRC-20, I refer to the tokens that are inscribed on the Bitcoin network. And so I do want you to understand, however, that BRC-20s are basically inscribed on chain but have to be read off chain, whereas ERC-20s start off chain and are completely different. And so their architecture is completely different, even though the naming convention is the same. A little annoying, but I understand why the naming convention was created this way. And then last but certainly not least is the eighth section here. We'll look at BRC wallets and resources. There's not that many, to be honest, right now. So I'll point you into a direction of two websites that have ways to connect, and you can even mint your own inscriptions. And also, an NFT marketplace, I believe, where you can kind of look and see. And so I do want to preface to say, like, this is a very young ecosystem as well. And with this ecosystem being very young, there's going to be a lot of discovery as far as what you might learn about this. And so there's a good chance that you listening to me might eclipse me on my understanding of this, and you may already know more than me already as it is. And I think that's a great thing. I'm not against the the apprentice becoming the master kind of thing, because that, first of all, that's just how the world works. I think me, I'm a father, and I think some of you are as well, or a parent at least. And one day you want your child to be in many ways better than you. And so it is similar along those lines, but also this is a very This is a new dynamic to the crypto world. It's also a very complicated aspect of the crypto world. It's bringing a lot of new things because it's very similar to ERC-20s. As I said, it's very similar to NFTs, but it's also way different. The way that it adapts is different. It's I understand some of the controversy behind it, and so it's very, very, very different. And so I think that also lends a little bit of humility to try to understand this as well. So anyway, that's the introduction as far as what the content will bring. So let's get started into the first section of this presentation. All right, so the first one is what are BRCs and what is the BRC ecosystem? And so, in short, BRCs are tokens that are on the Bitcoin chain that can be used in mostly the same way as like layer 2 tokens and ERC, which is L2 tokens. I basically said the same thing twice. That are used on the Ethereum network. And so I've kind of said a little bit of this already, but BRC is basically like a method to use the Bitcoin network, the Bitcoin chain, to be able to create tokens that we can use in the same way that we use ERC-20 tokens, and to create both fungible, which ERCs are fungible, but fungible and non-fungible tokens. So NFTs, for example. And so that's basically what BRCs are in a nutshell. Now, there are similarities, but BRC-20s are not based off smart contracts. And so they're actually based off of JSON inscriptions. So what happens is that you look at a certain number of satoshis on the Bitcoin network, and you're able to inscribe them as a whole. So you gather all the satoshis together in one place. You do have to have a minimum, and then you can inscribe that minimum using like a JSON file, and it's the file is actually printed on chain, and then you can use off-chain methods to gather that data. Okay, and then that's where the BRCs come from. Those end up retaining value depending on the type of token or the popularity or whatever the value is determined by that. So BRCs have inscriptions instead, which are called ordinals. So ordinals are inscriptions. They're almost interchangeably the same word as far as how we detail this on the BRC network. And I hate using the phrase BRC network because it's not necessarily a network. It's just Bitcoin blocks. And so it is a network in some sense, but it's not like a huge network like Ethereum. It's very isolated, and that's one of the big cons that people talk about is that it can and does lead to congestion issues. And so these ordinals are non-fungible in nature. So by default, they are non-fungible. And so non-fungible is basically your tokens, your Litecoin, your Ethereum, all those tokens that you trade on your exchange or your wallet, those are all fungible. And fungible basically means is if I have one Bitcoin and you have one Bitcoin and we trade those Bitcoin, if I give you my Bitcoin and then I trust you to give yours to me, we have each other's Bitcoin. So the addresses are different, right? But the value is the same. Nothing is indistinguishable other than the address, but the address doesn't share that value. And so that's why those are fungible. But ordinals, inscriptions themselves, are non-fungible in nature. Um, they and one reason that they're not is because you have token IDs attached to them on the JSON file, and so that also creates things like NFTs. So technically, they are considered NFTs by default, which brings an interesting discussion, perhaps, maybe a more in-depth discussion later on, because NFTs, we are used to NFTs being like Bored Apes and things like that. But NFTs are not necessarily Bored Apes per se. They're just non-fungible tokens. They don't have to be visual in nature. In fact, they aren't really like. You could argue that you know Bored Apes are not physical in nature. They have to be made visual in nature. I should say visual, not physical. But you can physically make them into things like T-shirts or whatever, and so that's how you get that, right? And it's no different than saying, all right, this presentation I'm showing you, like you are seeing words on the screen, but these words are actually just ones and zeros on a screen. And so that's what I mean by that, right? And so NFTs don't have to be the NFTs that we know today as Bored Apes and Moonbirds and things like that. It could be other things. We'll get into that as well. And then last here on is BRCs are minted tokens, so they have to be minted. You take satoshis from a certain part of the network and you mint them. So there actually are limitations to how many mints that you can do on the network. Now, I don't think we'll ever eclipse that. I think that would probably take 20 years or so. I don't know offhand how many that would be because the number of satoshis can vary, but it is limited because there's only a limited number of satoshis, right? I mean, there's a limited number of Bitcoin, 21 million, and so there's was it like a million? Was it 8 digits or so? So it's million or 10 million satoshis per Bitcoin. So then you can do the math on that, and so there is a limited amount. It's an extremely high number, but it is a fixed number, and so that can lead to limitations, of course, but that can also lead to uh, rarity. And so that means there is a limited supply, just like there's a limited supply of Bitcoin. And so it's one of those things like buying one Bitcoin 6 years ago, um, or even 5 years ago would have been $3,000 to $4,000. So very easy. 10 years ago it would have been much much cheaper, right? So when I first started, Bitcoin was $30. And I didn't buy at the time. The cheapest one that I ever bought was like 4,200. And that's pretty cheap compared to today's numbers. But as it becomes more rare to buy, like some people will be fortunate to only have half a Bitcoin. And so right now, half a Bitcoin isn't that bad, $20,000, right? Um, but it just depends as far as the rarity goes. So a little too deep for this video, but that's kind of what the minted tokens kind of represent. All right, now we'll go on to the next section. So what are ordinals exactly? I've kind of described this in some way, but ordinals are the inscriptions that you actually put on the sets of satoshis that you use for the BRC network, so to speak. So as I said, ordinals and inscriptions they don't necessarily have to be BRC-20 tokens. I know I've kind of mentioned this several times already, but there is a distinction, and we should make a distinction between BRC-20 tokens and BRC like NFTs, which are called ordinals. So the NFTs, so when somebody says ordinals, they typically refer to NFTs. So that's kind of the vernacular that they use. That is not necessarily a technically accurate vernacular, but that is what is used. So when people say ordinals, they typically say NFTs, but it doesn't have to be the case. That being said, in addition to that, when they talk about BRCs, they typically talk about the actual tokens, the ordinals that are more fungible in nature. So it can be very confusing. And so ordinals are really just JSON files or inscriptions. So what that looks like is, most of you have probably seen a JSON file of some sort. It's just a string of JSON data that's organized properly with ID numbers and metadata, more or less. And so those are used as inscriptions, and those inscriptions are used to program sats. And so I should have wrote that better and said satoshis. So it takes a certain set of satoshis, takes them aside from I mean, they're still on the network, of course, but they set them aside and kind of put them and batch them together and put basically a stamp on them, and that stamp is the inscription. So think of it like that way. Like think of like just taking a bunch of letters, putting a stamp on it, or whatever you want to do, and that's how they program those. Because you've been able to do things like this ever since Bitcoin's been created, technically, but it wasn't necessarily used in this way. So, for example, you could write messages when you send Bitcoin from one person to another. People can put links to images, and people have done various things with that. But now this takes it a step further by putting JSON on that. and using that as written data that can be interpreted. And so I do want to mention that the interpretations of that data so are done off chain. And so we'll get into the pros and cons of that overall, but that's I want you to know that the JSON file itself is on chain. It's not a file. I should stop saying file. But the JSON inscription is on chain, but the interpretation on how to view that JSON inscription is done off chain. That will be important later in this video. Descriptions are a data set to give us various ID names and functionality for things like NFTs and tokens. So very similar to what I've just said. And these are not used via smart contracts. And that needs to be really expressed that this is not like Ethereum at all. Ethereum was purposed and created for the reason to create a smart contract system for various purposes, not just for money, but also other things like identifications, layer two and scalability, things like that. It was meant to be in part a scaling solution and for other projects to do what they need to do, and so on and so forth. But Bitcoin does not use smart contracts. It never has. There's probably a debate that it ever will. If it does, it would have to hard fork, and then that would be up to you to determine its own value for you. But as of right now, it does not use smart contracts. It never intended to use smart contracts. Smart contracts and DeFi, in the sense that in the sense that it's used today, is not the original vision for Satoshi. And so it was purely meant as a Bitcoin to be used as a peer-to-peer. And so that's the distinction. I don't know if Satoshi really had DeFi in mind, and it doesn't actually matter necessarily. That's a big debate overall, but with this, you just need to understand that Bitcoin does not use smart contracts. It doesn't rely on oracles, doesn't rely on anything like that. It uses everything on chain, on its language and its block network. So, ordinal data, I mis spelt that, so I apologize. Ordinal data can be used for lots of things, but I've mentioned four right here. So NFTs is the big one. That's kind of what we know. Doesn't necessarily have to be the BAYC on this. It could be other aspects of that as well. It could just be used for images in general and sending messages even. Tokens, as we also talked about with the BRCs, and also can be used for identification. So each JSON inscription does have an ID on it. That's how you are able to recognize it. And when you mint them, you can assign that ID as well. So it can be used for things that are used for identification. So that is important, and I think that one will be the least likely use case, but that is an option, right? So, all right, so that's basically what ordinals are in that regard. Let's go ahead and move forward. All right, so are they legit? So what's the controversy? So we kind of mentioned this beforehand. There's a lot of debate. A lot of maxis tend to take a negative approach, and they'll use some of these down here, where other people that are kind of pro ordinal will use some of the top ones here. So we'll kind of get into this. Um, but the basic thing is BRCs and ordinals have disrupted the way that we think about Bitcoin, and that is a true statement as far as that goes. I think we can be on both sides of the fence. I honestly do not care if you are pro ordinal or anti ordinal. I don't care. I really don't. I'm just here to educate on what this looks like. As of what I know, um, I am open to. Like I'm pro ordinal basically is because I'm open to the technology about that. There's this is kind of a side note, but like there's a lot of debate among my peer network in real life. I have a much different network in real life than I do in the crypto world. And a lot of people that I know in real life are very anti electric vehicles. And I say that to say that I recently drove a Tesla for one of my vacations and mainly to try it. And so and I say all this to say like whether you agree with EVs or don't, and I'll reserve my take on that. It's not fair to me to have an opinion unless I didn't drive one first. See what I'm saying? So it's just, and that's how I view this, and that's why I wanted to bring the pros and cons to let you make this decision. Do you think this is good or not? And it might not even be up to you to decide. Like you may think ordinals are a bad thing, but there's nothing you can do about it. The whole point is that the consensus of Bitcoin establishes that, right? And some of you guys may not even care at all, but as long as it makes you money, you're on board, and that's okay. I think that's completely fine. And so I don't really care what side you're on. I don't think there even needs to be a side. I don't think about these things that hard, um, as far as everything goes. But I'm just going to show you why there's controversy, what's the pros and cons, and you've probably read this by now by the time I'm rambling. But anyway, um, the way that we've thought of the way that we're thinking about ordinals is starting to get us to rethink about how Bitcoin is used and functions, and this has caused disagreements on how ordinals are viewed. And so some of the pros, we'll kind of get into the pros and cons here. So one of the benefits or pros or whatever you want to call it is ordinals have helped create a new dynamic to the BTC chain and expand functionality. So one of the things, for better or worse, that people like and people don't like about Bitcoin is that it really hasn't changed in the past, 6 to 8 years. I mean, really, the only biggest dynamic that I saw was like, what was it? Like Bitcoin Cash was a big thing when I first started. Like Roger Ver was all over like he was the number one person that everybody talked about. Okay, but as far as that go, it's talking about that was about changing the hash rate and things like that. And honestly, like looking back, I don't think Bitcoin Cash was really that terrible. I just think the method of what they were trying to do was terrible. Roger Ver and Bitcoin Cash people were trying to take over the network to use it for their own reasons, and they ultimately failed because of their own demise. The whole idea of trying to separate and do your own thing caused other people to have their own ideas as well, which that's how we came up with BSV, and everything like that. So, but as far if you look at the complete history of it, I mean, Bitcoin really hasn't changed, versus somebody like chains like Ethereum, which have changed significantly. But that's not necessarily a bad thing either. And so anyway, I use ordinals as this is a complete new functionality for Bitcoin, completely new kids on the block kind of aspect where it's like, all right, this is a big deal. And for some people, that brings value proposition. The second thing is, although some congestion is expected, which we'll get into in a second, BRCs can be considered potentially more reputable since Bitcoin is the main chain. So I said that kind of clunky, but what that basically means is, would you rather trust an NFT on, um, was it Matic or Bitcoin? See what I'm saying? So you may do Matic, and I'm not saying you can't, but I'm saying is like a lot of people, in the ETF situation brings this to a certain light that I'm trying to say is that everybody's talking about a Bitcoin or or a Ethereum ETF. Nobody cares about Bonk ETF, right? Like that's not going to be a thing, or Dog with Hat ETF. That would be very funny. I would laugh my butt off if I saw that. But one of the reasons why Bitcoin's on the forefront is because it's got the reputation. Of course it does. And so most people, when they get into crypto, if someone asked me to get into crypto now with having no knowledge, I would mainly just say Bitcoin, because it is the reputable one. And so I think that also gives us some weight for the BRCs. I think that could be a little more, I don't want to say trustworthy, but um, could hold some more integrity versus a newer chain, like I don't know, like well, even as some as like AVAX, for example. AVAX has a good NFT system actually, as most EVM chains do. But it's you also have to bridge your money over there. Then you got to go to this marketplace and do all this. And then honestly, the more steps that you do, the value will dramatically decrease over time with NFTs, especially since they're more illiquid. The NFTs are more illiquid than tokens are. And so anyway, that's the second one. Third one is BRC-20 tokens. So the BRC-20 tokens, not the NFTs, allow for more growth and the expansion of DeFi as a whole while also preserving the integrity. And so, again, that allows Bitcoin to be part of the DeFi world as a lot of people think it should. And I think there's a lot of agreements, and I think there's a lot of contrasting opinions about this, but I don't really consider Bitcoin part of the DeFi world. That's the whole reason that wrapped Bitcoin exists. And so with the BRC-20 tokens, that does allow kind of an avenue to get into that, right? And so a lot of people, do think about Bitcoin and DeFi together, even though they are not. And so this allows for more decentralized growth, not just using Bitcoin as a store of value or a peer-to-peer exchange of value, but also with NFTs and other tokens. So now, what are some cons? So the cons are, the first one is ordinals are not an original idea of Satoshi, and it's considered outside the bounds of the typical peer-to-peer concept. And so this is where like the Bitcoin maxis really they stumble. It's a stumbling block here for them, is because Bitcoin maxis don't like to um, look outside the bounds of what Satoshi has intended, which is weird because Bitcoin maxis don't even use generally Bitcoin as how Satoshi intended, because it's meant to use as a peer-to-peer exchange, not necessarily as a store of value. So that's not really the discussion at hand. When we're talking about ordinals, however, a lot of it's very hostile towards the way that Bitcoin maxis think, and it's very interesting because it doesn't necessarily disrupt Bitcoin maxis per se. And so they tend to use this as an example. Well, it wasn't the original intent. It's going to cause problems with the network, with security and congestion. Some of those are true. Some of those are not true. And some of them are true, but are very nuanced. Excuse me. So, but typically that's considered a con. Is that ordinals for them are considered a net negative. And so that just depends on your point of view with that particular one. Another one is BRCs create unnecessary congestion for those wanting to use BTC as a payment rail. And so this is somewhat true and somewhat not true. But I mentioned it as a con because a lot of people's arguments against BRCs and whether they should be legitimate is because you're almost kind of brute forcing NFTs onto the network. So whereas Ethereum was designed, so actually, technically, Ethereum was not designed for NFTs. Ethereum was designed for smart contracts, and one of the resolutions down the line with ERC 721 was that you would get NFTs as a result. So that was not a built-in benefit when Ethereum was created, but Ethereum was created to be more open with its future benefits to include NFTs, if that makes sense, right? And so that's a little bit nuanced with that, but with Bitcoin, not only was it never intended, like it was never even thought about, and there's not really a way to do NFTs and BRC-20 tokens as it would with other chains. And so even the use of the term BRC-20 is basically a ripoff of ERC-20, right? And so a lot of people do consider the JSON inscriptions as almost a brute force method. And so it's kind of it can be, and I would even consider it clunky. It's a little bit clunky in its method, to try to use a BRC-20 wallet and inscriptions and minting. It's very complicated. It's very like I can't really even show you in the presentation because it is a very clunky process. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do it, but also at the same time, using a DeFi wallet was very clunky 4 years ago. I mean, so now it's very easy. So I think this is a con as far as how it's presented today, but it may not necessarily be a problem tomorrow. However, when you're going towards the congestion route, it is causing some congestion, um, but and that it really depends on as far as like how you use it as a payment rail, like how much money are you transferring back and forth, and it doesn't really cause too much congestion overall, but it does increase it, and some people think that that is a negative. The third one is ordinals are not NFTs in the same nature as other chains like ETH and Sol. So I kind of mentioned that they kind of just brute force that in there. It's like they just kind of it's almost like sending a letter in the mail and then you write more of the letter on the outside of the envelope. Like yes, it's technically part of the letter, but it's also like not. So it's like that's how you view that, right? And so you're kind of forcing something to happen, and it does work. Like I can code, like I've done apps and programs, things like that. And I've been able to cheat in some ways where it's like this will work. Like it looks like the Hunchback of Notre Dame, but it does work. And so that's kind of the same point with the BRC NFTs. So that's kind of the pros and cons and the controversy, so to speak. But as far as its legitimacy, like I would say it is legitimate, but some people don't view it as that. So, and that's completely okay. I'm just here to present the facts. All right, so we're going to go on the differences between BRC, ERC, and other chains. So we've kind of discussed a little bit about this. Basically, they have the same idea overall as far as they are tokens on a network, but there are some differences and similarities. So we'll go over the similarities first. So first of all, they are tokens on the BRC. They're tokens on their respective networks, BRC network, ERCs, and they are both fungible, which I've expressed before. If I give you a Bitcoin, you give me a Bitcoin. We have each other's Bitcoin, but it's worth the same amount. Everything's pretty much the same except for the hash function, and the address and all that, the confirmation and the scanning for that. In addition to that, they both are similar in their idea as a scaling solution. Now they are completely different in their architecture, but they are very similar in the way they're trying to solve a problem. And I would even argue that BRC-20s aren't really trying to solve a problem. They're just trying to create they're almost idealists in nature. They're not trying to solve anything. They're just trying to see what other functionality they can do. And I think that that's actually great in its own idea. But as far as BRCs and ERCs together, they are similar as that they both can provide scaling options. Now, they aren't necessarily the best solutions, but they are able to scale what is currently what was capable just a year ago. So anyway, so that's the second one. Third, and this is a little more nuanced, but they both use metadata to an extent, and I made sure I put to an extent because I wouldn't necessarily call them metadata um, just kind of outright, but as a blanket statement, it does kind of work because JSON does use, or it does use a JSON inscription that you just add on top of, like I said, like writing a note on top of a sealed envelope letter. That's how Bitcoin uses the BRC inscriptions, whereas Ethereum it uses it it in the network itself, which I'll get into. That's the differences I'll get into, but they both use metadata types, so you can change it. That's how NFTs are actually working on the ERC, on the Ethereum network anyway. Is that it's really just lines of code or messages that you put in or what have you, and it basically modifies that to a visual representation. All right, now on to the differences. So BRCs, so it's a little takes a little bit to understand, but BRCs are done on chain, while ERC-20s are done off chain. Now, you may disagree with the way that I presented that, but what I mean by that is that BRC tokens and inscriptions are on chain. Like every 100% of it is on chain because everything is used by looking at satoshis, inscripting your own, you know, your inscriptions or minting. And so you mint BRCs by taking a batch of satoshis and putting that inscription on there and declaring it as a mint. And so all those are done on chain. It's a little more nuanced to that. I'll get to that in a second. But um, that's kind of how that is. Where ERC-20s are designed to do it technically off chain. And so that's the whole point of L2s as a scaling solution. So the L2s, so like let's take Chainlink for example. So Chainlink is a network. It's its own network, but it's an Ethereum based network, so it's on the Ethereum chain. But the Chainlink tokens themselves are not on the ERC chain. And so just because you have Chainlink and you have all these other chains that are L2s doesn't necessarily make Ethereum more congested, although it does with going back and forth with gas fees and things like that. But as far as its architecture, it is a little bit different. Now, it does have to rely on on-chain data to retrieve the ERC-20 token, data and all that. So it's a little nuance, and I know I might get some heat for explaining it that way or discussion, and that's okay. I welcome the discussion, but it is just slightly different in its architecture. Another thing is ERC-20s are smart contract oriented. So like the Ethereum network is designed for tokens like Chainlink to be fruitful on that chain. Whereas BRC-20 tokens, so like one of them is like Ordi, I think that's the most common one, is it wasn't really meant, like Bitcoin wasn't meant to do that originally, and so it's not smart contract oriented. Now you can still do it as I said, but you also lose some things, like you lose the ability to be flexible with it, because once you inscribe, it's hard to uninscribe, I should say. So it's very difficult. Ethereum allows for that flexibility. I mean, then BRCs are less programmable and limited in flexibility, kind of what I just said. And so you're very limited on, like, a limited choice of options, how to inscribe, what you can do, how many inscribes you can do, versus ERC and Ethereum network, which is a little more palatable in that sense. And I don't mean to say ERC necessarily. It could be Solana tokens, it could be other chain tokens. I'm just using ERC as an example. So, and there's some limitations for BRC 20s as well. The minting must be done in set intervals of Satoshis, and they have limited minting procedures, so they have to be done a certain way. It's a very complicated process. I can't really get into that too much, but it's much different versus ERC and even Solana. Like Solana, minting on tokens on Solana is very easy actually, and I think a lot of people don't understand how easy that is for Solana to achieve. BRC actually is a step backwards from Ethereum on how it can be minted, the type of, the money that it costs, things like that. Then the second one is checking balances and scanning for BRCs and ordinals must be done off chain. And so that may not necessarily be a surprise or even a bad thing. It's just a limited thing. Like you can't just look on chain and be like, okay, this is, my money or whatever. So like you actually have to use an off chain product or protocol. But that's honestly nothing different than using like a wallet, for example, like Trust Wallet or MetaMask. So like MetaMask is technically on off chain. It's just using on chain data to interpret that. And so a lot of times, however, when you check balances on chain, you can typically see how much Bitcoin that is, and then you can do the math yourself into US dollars or whatever your currency is. Now, ordinals and BRCs is a whole different ballgame. You don't really know what you got. You need to have an interpreter basically to see what you have, and so that's probably that's more of a limitation than people expect, but it's becoming less of a limitation probably as time goes on, since people use things like Rabby Wallet or whatever to kind of interpret things for them. So now we're going to go a little bit into the ordinal protocol, and I'm just going to make this very brief. But basically, this is ordinals.com. This is a doc section left from a Git book or whatever, and I won't really go into this too much because it's very heavy on the technical side. But this shows you what ordinals do, how it works, how the inscriptions work, how it delegates all the metadata and the pointers and recursions that are involved in that. And so this goes into things like segwits and taproots and all that. It's a very heavy read. I wouldn't recommend. I mean, if you want to sleep, you can read this more towards the nighttime, I guess. But this is very heavy. You don't necessarily need to know any of this, by the way. It's just kind of a little added extra add-on for those interested in more technical things. So I'll link this into the video. This will be sent as a YouTube video, and I'll put the link in the description for that. But that's basically the ordinal protocol in a nutshell. All right, so now I'm going to go into some BRC tokens. I'll look into some websites for the wallets and things like that as well. We're getting kind of into the ending of this presentation, but here's some examples. So Ordi is a popular one, and I got this from a website. I'll link the link in the description as well for the resources. But very popular ones are Ordi, Wojak, Pisa, and Track. And so most of these right now are just like what I can't think of the word, just speculative, and just like they're experimental per se. I wouldn't say experimental, but they don't have like super serious utility, I should say. But as you guys know, in the crypto world, that doesn't necessarily need to be a requirement. Because like Bonk, for example, is a very hot coin, and it doesn't really need any of that, right? So, these are the tokens that are kind of current and popular and doing very good. And you got Ordi here is like 1.46 billion. Like it's very significant, and so that's not something to shy away from. Ordi by far, obviously, is the most popular. Um, but I don't want you to shy away from how popular these are becoming. And the idea that most people still don't know even what ordinals are, how they even use them, how they even buy them. I think this is going to get very significantly higher over the course of the next 12 months. So, and then I mean, because Wojak is the next one, which at 23 million, so it's way, way, way down. And even Pisa is at 6 million, things like that. And Track is like number 10. I can't even remember how much that was, but and so keep that in mind. Like if ordinals and BRC-20 tokens take off, these valuations are going to be much much higher, probably 100 times higher. I don't I'm not scared to say it could be 100 times. I think definitely 10 to 20 times, possibly 50, but there is a chance it could be 100, depending because 1.4 billion is not a lot, per se. And so we'll see how that goes. Um, but it could be early. I don't really know. And so those are just some examples with that. Now for some things like BRC wallets and exchanges. So there's a few that I'm going to mention here. The first one is ordinalswallet.com. This is kind of like a hybrid website where you got things like NFTs. It is a wallet that you can use. And so up here you can inscribe if you want to inscribe. You have to connect your wallet, and then you could look at your files, text, and all that kind of stuff. So it's very flexible. I say Ordinal Wallets is probably one of the number one places to go to as far as this goes. You can also do some trades if you want to. And you can also switch between Bitcoin and Doge, because I think Doge also does ordinals as well, because I think Doge is based off of Bitcoin with a few different tweaks. And so you can do that as well, inscribe and do all that. Another one is going to be BRC20.io. And there's a few different exchanges relative to this, but these are the coins, and so these are, I guess, the market caps and all that. I'm not too familiar with the website overall, but you got things like Ordi, for example, and that shows what you got with the supply and the price and all that kind of stuff. So it's gone up a little bit since I've talked about it on earlier in the recording. So those are the two things, but you can also connect here. And so you use Unisat. So that's one of the things. Like Unisat is probably one of the other wallets that I would recommend. So Unisat or the Ordinals wallet are the top two wallets that you can use with this. And so actually here's really good. This is a good wallet selection. Ordinals, Unisat, top two by far. And so I didn't even know Phantom could be used. And so if it does, let me know. But those are the exchanges and the wallets with all that. And so that's pretty much the video. If you want to do some more resources, like Chainlink actually has a really good couple of resources that I was looking at. So if you want to know more, like this is a good one. What are ordinals? You can check that out. It also has one called what is BRC token, BRC-20 tokens, and those are pretty good as well. And so you can kind of look at those. And obviously, like CoinDesk and everybody else has some. So anyway, that's the video. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this was um, well explained, and I'm sorry for some of my stuttering and things like that. And so again, I apologize for the delay in the time. I want to try to get the resources put together with this. Let me know what you think. I'm happy to continue having discussions about BRC-20s and ordinals. And I want you to keep in mind that I'm trying to like I'm not trying to like I don't know as much as you think I know about this. And so it's just something where like I do know a few things, and it's a combination of the people that I work with, as far as my job go, as far as my business goes, I should say. And part of that is to try out projects and new things like that. So I am coming with a little bit of a head start, but I also want to come to this with a humble heart as well, to say like, hey, I'm here to learn with you as well. So um, let me know what you think, honestly, and I'm happy to keep this discussion for this video rolling. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time.